She was 49 years old, had 3 children, a relentless routine, and a blood test that left the doctor's office in silence. LDL of 320. The cardiologist looked at the paper, looked at her, and remained silent for a few seconds. When he spoke, he chose his words carefully. With that number, you're not on the borderline. You're on the other side of the borderline. She tried to understand what that meant. She asked if she was at risk. He said yes. She asked what kind of risk. He explained, premature heart attack, silent buildup of plaque in the arteries, a heart working against a current he couldn't see but felt all the time. She left the doctor's office with a prescription in hand, a follow-up appointment scheduled for 60 days later, and a question that wouldn't leave her mind. Is it possible to change that number without relying on medication for the rest of my life? She had heard stories of people who reversed their cholesterol with diet. I had read things on the internet, but I didn't know what was real, what was myth, and what was wishful thinking from someone who didn't want to face reality. So she decided to do things differently. She wasn't going to trust Instagram posts. She was going to understand the mechanism. She was going to know exactly what was happening inside her body, and act accordingly. What she discovered and what she did in the following 60 days surprised the cardiologist, and it will change the way you look at cholesterol forever. To understand what she did, you first need to understand why her cholesterol was so high. And here begins the part that most people don't know, and that completely changes the conversation. There's a fact that debunks the most common belief about cholesterol. Approximately 70 to 80% of the cholesterol circulating in your blood doesn't come from food. It's manufactured by your own body, primarily by the liver, which produces an average of 700 to 1,000 milligrams of cholesterol per day, every day, regardless of what you ate for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. This means that cutting out eggs, cutting out butter, cutting out red meat, without understanding the mechanism, can make very little difference. Because the biggest producer of cholesterol isn't on your plate, it's inside you. Diet does contribute, yes, but what you eat has a much smaller influence on cholesterol absorption than it does on liver production. And that distinction is everything. Now comes the second piece of information that few people know. An LDL level of 320 milligrams per deciliter isn't just a high number. It's a clinical sign. An LDL level at this level is strongly suggestive of a condition called heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, a genetic alteration that affects approximately 1 in 200 people, and most are never diagnosed. What does this condition do? It impairs the liver's ability to remove LDL from the blood. Instead of capturing and processing the LDL particles circulating in the bloodstream, the liver allows them to accumulate, year after year, decades before any symptoms appear. The problem is that this silent buildup has devastating consequences if left untreated. LDL doesn't cause damage on its own while in the blood. The problem begins when it crosses the endothelium, the layer of cells lining the inner wall of arteries, and becomes trapped in the subendothelial space. There, it is oxidized, and when oxidized, it attracts macrophages, immune system cells that try to swallow the oxidized LDL. These macrophages fill with fat and transform into what doctors call foam cells, which form fatty streaks in the arteries, which evolve into plaques, which harden, can rupture, and cause a heart attack or stroke. This process takes years to become visible, but it begins silently, long before any symptoms appear. In people with untreated familial hypercholesterolemia, the risk of coronary heart disease is up to 13 times higher. The cholesterol load that an average person accumulates in their arteries by age 55, someone with this untreated condition accumulates by age 35. That's 20 years of increased risk. When she heard that, she understood the cardiologist's expression. She wasn't on the edge. She was on the other side. But she also understood something else, that genetics is not destiny, that the body responds, and that she had 60 days to prove it. What she changed were 2 habits. Just 2. But chosen with surgical precision, based on real biological mechanisms, not guesswork. The first habit was related to food. And the logic wasn't to cut it out, it was to replace it. To understand why replacement matters more than cutting, you need to understand how the liver controls LDL. The liver has specific receptors on the surface of its cells to capture LDL particles circulating in the blood. When these receptors function properly and are present in sufficient quantity, they pull the LDL into the hepatocyte, where it is processed and eliminated. The LDL falls. When these receptors decrease, whether due to genetics or dietary habits, LDL remains in the bloodstream without being removed. LDL levels rise. The production of these receptors is controlled by a transcription factor called SREBP2. When cholesterol inside liver cells is low, SREBP2 is activated, migrates to the cell nucleus, and increases the expression of LDL receptors. When intracellular cholesterol is high, SREBP2 is blocked. The receptors decrease. LDL in the blood rises. Saturated fats directly interfere with this mechanism. They raise free cholesterol within hepatocytes, keep SREBP2 inactive, and reduce the production of LDL receptors. The result is not that saturated fat turns into LDL in the blood. The result is that it prevents the liver from clearing the LDL that was already there. Trans fats are even more aggressive. A study published in the New England Journal of Medicine demonstrated that replacing healthy fat with trans fat caused two simultaneous and opposite changes in the lipid profile. LDL increased and HDL decreased. Two problems with a single ingredient. Because trans fat increases hepatic production of VLDL and activates a protein called CETP, which transfers cholesterol from HDL to LDL, emptying good cholesterol to fatten bad cholesterol. That was her first goal, to eliminate excess saturated fat and completely eliminate trans fat. Processed meat, ultra-processed foods with partially hydrogenated fat, industrial fried foods, out. But eliminating fat without replacing it doesn't solve the problem, because the body needs fat. The question is, what kind? Monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, present in olive oil, nuts, avocados, and oily fish, do not block SREBP2. On the contrary, when they replace saturated fats in the diet, they allow LDL receptors to increase. The classic meta-analysis by Mensink et al., published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, quantified that each 1% of energy from saturated fat replaced by polyunsaturated fat reduces LDL by approximately 2.1 milligrams per deciliter. The second target was soluble fiber, specifically beta-glucan. Beta-glucan is a polysaccharide found in oats and barley. When it reaches the small intestine, it absorbs water and forms a viscous solution, a gel that coats the intestinal mucosa and surrounds the fat micelles that carry cholesterol for absorption. This gel hinders the absorption of dietary cholesterol. But the most important effect is another. The intestine naturally reabsorbs about 95% of the bile acids that the liver secretes to aid digestion. These bile acids are made from cholesterol, and their recycling cycle is what allows the liver to avoid using new cholesterol with each meal. Beta-glucan traps bile acids within the gel it forms and carries them out of the body in feces. The liver needs to manufacture new bile acids, and for this, it uses intracellular cholesterol. The cholesterol stock in hepatocytes decreases. SREBP2 is activated. LDL receptors increase. LDL in the blood is removed more efficiently. It's the same mechanism as bile sequestrants, a class of drugs used precisely for this purpose, arriving via food. The effective dose is at least 3 grams of beta-glucan per day. This is equivalent to approximately 40 to 60 grams of rolled oats. This level of evidence is so robust that the American FDA approved a health claim for oats and cholesterol back in 1997. Meta-analyses with more than 3,000 participants show that this dose reduces LDL by an average of 9 to 10 milligrams per deciliter. She started eating oatmeal for breakfast every day. Without exception, she switched from cooking oil to olive oil. She began including nuts, almonds, walnuts, in small daily amounts. He started reading labels carefully, specifically to identify and eliminate partially hydrogenated fats. It wasn't a radical diet. It was a smart diet, based on mechanism, not on fads. The second habit was physical, and simpler than she imagined. She started walking, 30 to 40 minutes a day, most days of the week. No gym, no personal trainer, no running app. Just her, a pair of sneakers, and the block around her house. Why does walking work against cholesterol? Aerobic exercise has a direct effect on LDL, reducing it by an average of 5 to 7 milligrams per deciliter. But the most significant impact is on HDL, the cholesterol that removes plaque from the arteries and takes it back to the liver for processing. A meta-analysis published in the journal Archives of Internal Medicine compiled data from 25 clinical trials and arrived at a precise number. Regular aerobic exercise raises HDL by an average of 2.53 milligrams per deciliter. It seems like a small amount, but each increase of 1 milligram per deciliter in HDL is associated with a 2 to 3% reduction in cardiovascular risk. And the most surprising finding of this meta-analysis, the strongest predictor of increased HDL was not exercise intensity. It wasn't weekly frequency, it was session duration. Every additional 10 minutes per session adds approximately 1.4 milligrams per deciliter of HDL. This means that a 40-minute walk is metabolically different from two 20-minute walks on the same day. The body responds to the continuous duration of effort in a way that fragmented sessions do not reproduce in the same way. The mechanisms are multiple and precise. Exercise increases lipoprotein lipase activity in muscles, an enzyme that breaks down triglycerides in VLDL and releases residues that become precursors to HDL. It increases hepatic synthesis of apolipoprotein A1, the structural protein of HDL. Without ApoA1, there is no functional HDL. It reduces the activity of CETP, the protein that normally transfers cholesterol from HDL to LDL, depleting good cholesterol. And it increases the expression of ABCA1 and SRB1 receptors, which participate in reverse cholesterol transport, the process by which cholesterol is removed from cells and returned to the liver. When diet and exercise are combined, the effects are additive. Studies of combined interventions document reductions in LDL between 7 and 15%, reductions in triglycerides between 4 and 18%, and increases in HDL between 5 and 14% over 8 weeks. The liver begins to respond within days. The most significant changes appear within 2 weeks, because LDL has a half-life of only 2 to 4 days in the blood, meaning that any sustained change in the rate of production or removal is reflected in the lipid profile very quickly. And within 60 days, the new steady state is established. She didn't know all of this when she started, but she walked the same way every day. On the 43rd day, she woke up with a different feeling. She couldn't quite name it. It was something between confidence and curiosity. She wanted to know what was happening inside her. He took an early test on his own initiative without waiting for the scheduled follow-up appointment. The result arrived 2 days later. LDL 231. She stood in front of the screen for a few minutes. She had dropped almost 90 points in less than 7 weeks. No medication, no formula, just oatmeal, olive oil, almonds, and walking. She hadn't celebrated yet. She knew 231 was still a high number. She knew the story wasn't over, but she understood that her body was responding. He continued. On the 60th day, she entered the cardiologist's office with the test results in her folder. He picked up the paper. He read it silently. LDL of 214, a reduction of 106 milligrams per deciliter, approximately a 33% drop in 2 months. He placed the paper on the table. He looked at her, and he said something she didn't expect to hear from a cardiologist. I had to double-check to make sure it was your exam. But here comes the part you need to listen to very carefully, because this is where the story becomes complete, and where it becomes honest. 214 is still high. For her profile, with a documented genetic component, the LDL target wasn't 214, it was below 100. The cardiologist was clear. The transformation had been extraordinary, but insufficient for the degree of risk she carried. Because when the problem is rooted in the genetics of the LDL receptor, in the liver's structural capacity to remove this cholesterol, lifestyle intervention has a limit. It pushes the system as far as it can go. But the system, in this case, was biologically limited from the start. The portfolio diet, which combines the mechanisms she used, viscous fiber, unsaturated fats, soy protein, plant sterols, nuts, was directly compared to a first-generation statin in a clinical trial published in JAMA in 2003. In 4 weeks, the diet reduced LDL by 28.6%. The statin reduced it by 30.9%. No statistically significant difference. But in severe familial hypercholesterolemia, even a 30% reduction in dietary intake isn't enough. Because the starting point is so high, even a significant reduction leaves the number in risky territory. She needed the medicine, and he accepted, with a completely different perspective than he would have had if he hadn't gone through those 60 days. It wasn't a defeat. It was a tool that, added to the habits she had built, didn't need to work alone. The lifestyle had done a good part of the work. The medication only needed to complete what the body had already begun. 3 months later, with the combination of statins and the same 2 habits, her LDL was at 87. The cardiologist said it was the result he expected, but that he rarely saw it in patients who started with 320. What her story teaches us is not that medicine is dispensable. It's that understanding is irreplaceable. When you know what's happening inside your body, when you understand that the liver produces most cholesterol, and that diet primarily influences production, not just absorption, when you know that saturated fat blocks the receptors that remove LDL from the blood, when you understand that the beta-glucan in oats activates precisely these receptors via bile acids, when you know that 40 minutes of continuous walking has a different metabolic effect than 4 sets of 10 minutes throughout the day, when you know all this, you stop treating the body as a mystery and start treating it as a system. And systems respond. The liver begins to adjust the lipid profile within days of a sustained change. The first measurable changes appear within 2 weeks, and in 60 days, the blood tells a completely different story. This doesn't mean that every case of high cholesterol resolves with oatmeal and walking. It means that every case of high cholesterol deserves an approach that understands the mechanism, not just the number. If you have high cholesterol, the first thing to do is see a doctor. Not as someone who will write a prescription, but as someone who will help you understand what is causing that number and what combination of tools is needed to change it. The second thing is this: start today. Don't wait for the appointment. Don't wait for the perfect result. Start with what you have. Oatmeal for breakfast. Replace cooking oil. Read the label before buying. Go for a walk, for long enough to allow your metabolism to respond. She started without knowing if it would work. She started because she needed to do something while she figured out the rest. And her body responded. Because bodies respond when you speak their language.